Another Death Knight crumbled to pieces amidst the cheers of Rolengork's warriors. Mitra moved with the growing number of freed-up guards to dispatch the next. Several defenders from Clan Kira filled the space that they left, cautiously examining the remains of the undead warrior as they dissipated in the wind. "I still can't wrap my head around the existence of the undead," Ranasaj said. "How can something so substantial just become dust?" "You've encountered elementals before, haven't you?" Soraka asked. "Of course," Ranasaj answered. "Most are water elementals that dwell in the rivers. We also have air and earth elementals in the mountains. But the undead have blades that cleave flesh and armor that can turn tooth and claw. I've heard that humans gird themselves for battle similarly, yet the undead leave nothing behind." "I suppose your confusion is in how you frame their existence," Soraka said. "As a living being, one tends to match what they see to what they are familiar with. Most tend to view clothing, accessories, combat equipment and vehicles as separate from the individuals that use them. For the undead, however, it is a part of their being. The undead are often compared to elementals because, despite their appearance, they come into existence as a complete concept. Here, you have undead from human-dominated realms, so they appear much as humans of different vocations do. A Death Knight comes into existence complete with the equipment of a knight, and that equipment disappears with it. Of course, any acquisitions that the undead made over the course of that existence wouldn't disintegrate with them if they were destroyed. The fact that the undead they were facing were summons neatly explained why they didn't have anything like that. Summoners rarely equipped their summons, after all. The question now was how they were being summoned. Undead such as Death Knights couldn't be created through a generic summon line spell. Groups of necromancers didn't simply perform rituals to create elder liches for research work. If it was possible, cabals of elder liches would just grow non-stop through the mass production of more elder liches by their members. The world would be a very different place if that were the case. Another Death Knight crumbled to dust. Now over their elation that the rout had been decisively stemmed, the battle's spectators appeared to be eagerly studying how the remaining undead were being dispatched. They wouldn't be able to handle them as easily as Soraka's entourage, but with so many of them, all they needed were suitable champions and mystics to support them to make the outcome slow, but inevitable. The main undead offensive was starting to enter the ravine, but the steady demise of the detachment sent to attack the rear had clearly given them pause. No Death Knights came charging up the slope, nor did any elder liches appear to try and bombard the fortifications. "Castari," he said. "Can you see what's going on down there?" "They're consolidating under cover on the far side of the ravine," the Gladestalker replied. "It looks like they're using weaker undead to probe the way ahead. Would you like us to get in close and attack them?" "No, our field defenses should get rid of all those weaklings," Soraka said. "Keep attacking the powerful undead that you can see. If they end up not doing anything, take the opportunity to rest. The more we fight, the more that undead commander learns. If we let it get away." "Karawaki?" Soraka asked, assuming that these undead have been summoned or created as summons. "How long would it take for them to replace this force we're facing?" "That would depend on how they're being made," Karawaki replied. "Elder liches, the naturally manifested ones that we know of, at least, can create permanent undead out of corpses. There is a limit to how many they can control, and the hordes that defend their lairs are numbered strictly within those limits. Field studies have noted that, even with plentiful corpses, they appear to be limited to creating 20 per day. The strength is dependent on the caster, but nothing much stronger than a bone vulture or skeleton warrior has been observed to be raised. All types of undead raised in this fashion are mindless, so no less of vampires, mummies, or the like." "What about spells?" "They can bolster those numbers with summoning spells, but summon line spells are limited in duration, that makes any build-up through them impossible. As for other methods, skeletal dragons are created through a series of rituals much like golems are, and I doubt anyone would be enforcing any laws against it where they come from." "How long does that take?" "The main delays come from the availability of animating force to bind to the construct. In addition to several months of binding rituals, we have to capture earth elementals of suitable strength to power our golems. No one would think of creating undead with similar rituals in most places because negative energy is so limited that it would take lifetimes to complete a single skeletal dragon." "Your people attempted such a thing?" Ranasaj asked. It was centuries ago when conflict along the Confederacy's borders was far more frequent, Kawabaki said. Some of our necromancers proposed that the negative energy generated from warfare could be captured and put to use by animating necromantic constructs like skeletal dragons. The product would then be put to use as an economic or military asset. That seems dangerous, Rana Saj said. The one thing that definitively limits warfare would instead become a reason to wage war. That's ultimately what led to the proposal's rejection, Kawabaki nodded. But only after a decade of deliberation by the Council. The answer may seem obvious to you, but advancement as a society can come with many illnesses. People who benefit from past growth and progress may start believing that growth and progress are objectively good things. This is especially the case if they are distanced from the costs. Our people have been forced to learn this lesson, often painfully, on several occasions. And some countries ignored those lessons entirely. The neighboring Minos League was one such place, a colossus built from the heedless expansion of industry and economic exploitation in the pursuit of profit and technological progress. Whether through diplomacy or conquest, they invariably transformed the world for the worse. So which one is it? Jericho asked, are these undead being created like an elder lich creates skeletons and zombies, or are they being assembled in some negative energy factory? That's impossible to say without extended study, and we can't discount the possibility of an unknown process. Even if a Death Knight took the same time to create as a war golem of equivalent strength, the undead have all the time in the world to create them so long as they remain undisturbed. I can easily see that happening if they're based in the center of that giant negative energy zone. In any case, Soraka said, it has to be stopped. No craft, technique, or knowledge possessed by these undead can be allowed to exist. Thankfully, this faction of undead appears to be isolated from the rest of the world. They must be destroyed before any fruit of their effort can spread. He couldn't imagine the catastrophe that would face them if it did. Powerful undead were relatively rare outside of the Dreadlands, but there were still enough to cause a major crisis if they learned how to do the same thing as the undead of the Katza Plains. And if the undead of the Dreadlands learn, the Crusader states will fall and half of the continent will go with them. Lesser undead have crossed the river, Kasturi said. They should be running into the field defenses any time now. I'm going to set the forbidden zones with the others now, Kawabaki said before stepping away. Soraka went over to the western edge of the tower, trying to catch a glimpse of their approaching foes. In addition to the magical defenses they had set, the ravine was a snarl of brush and trees. The sound of rustling leaves and snapping branches rose from below as the undead clumsily forced their way through. Bullets started whistling through the air as the defenders attempted to stave off their advance. Waste of bullets, Jericho grumbled. It's fine for now, Soraka said. If none of the defenders attacked, even the undead would know that something was going on. We're done down here. Anything interesting happen? No. Any sign of additional attacks along the shore? Not that I can tell. Strange. The undead that were sent against him were very powerful by most people's standards, but they had already been defeated a few times. If the enemy commander wanted to assault the first real line of defense, they should have sent more. Ooh, looks like they're here. Mitra came up to join them. She sat on her haunches at the edge of the tower, leaning forward for a better look. They're in the spiked growth, now, Kasturi said. The closest undead that he could spot was starting to fall over. 10 minutes passed and nothing made it out of the brush at the bottom of the ravine. Is that spell truly so powerful? Rana Saj said, some of our mystics do have it, but I've not seen it put to much practical use. It's good for when one knows where their opponents will traverse, Soraka told him. Your usual form of warfare is highly mobile and irregular, so spike growth is mostly useless in that situation. At most, one of your mystics might use it to hamper pursuit in a narrow area. Yes, that's what they mainly use it for. It doesn't obliterate our enemies like this, though. Most of the zombies out there are much weaker than your foes on the Orgulan front. They aren't strong enough to make it more than a few steps into the spike growth. Skeletal undead are resistant to piercing damage, so they should make it through, but Death Knights don't raise skeletons. Ghouls, ghasts and wights won't make it much farther than the zombies. Spectral undead won't be hit by the spikes, and blood meat hulks will regenerate their way through. Whether the undead commander would try to force their way through after discovering what lay in store for their forces was still in question. When they came up with the defensive scheme, They still assumed that the opposing side was something along the lines of an undead force directed by elder liches. Now, he wasn't sure how cautious the enemy commander would be. On one hand, they had just lost a squad of Death Knights on a fruitless attempt to break Rolengork's defenses despite the risk of loss being very real. On the other hand, they were using lesser undead to investigate those same defenses. It was more than a bit confusing, but Soraka supposed that he shouldn't expect their opponent to think like any living race that he knew of. Since they're undead from a human-dominated region, can I use that as a thematic base to work off of? He was already doing that, in part, working under the assumption that they were forming battle lines and using formations as humans did. The thing was that, when the undead went on the offensive, those formations dissolved and each undead soldier operated independently as things devolved into a chaotic brawl. Not that he was complaining. If anything, he was thankful that the undead commander hadn't figured out how to use empowered formations and didn't appear to be anywhere close. "Bloodmeat Hulk coming through," Castore said. A shadow in the undergrowth appeared several seconds later. The Bloodmeat Hulk eventually struggled its way through the fields of spiked growth. It left the brush and took one step before it disintegrated. "Ouch," Mitra said. "What was that?" Ranasaj asked. "It hit the Forbiddance Field," Karavaki answered from behind them. Several wraiths hit the field, similarly disintegrating. It was joined by several skeleton warriors and some other assorted undead. "Will the Death Knights be destroyed the same way?" "No," Karavaki said. "They can probably cross the field 4 or 5 times before being destroyed. The question now is whether the enemy forces will be deterred by the effect," Soraka said. "The undead, deterred?" Soraka shifted slightly at Karavaki's tone. "I know it's a weird thing to consider, but it is what it is. An undead commander will have a commander's insights, though they admittedly might take advantage of them in a characteristically undead way." "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Jirika said. A high-pitched wail filled the air as dozens of wraiths flew straight up the ravine. Many of the defenders stepped back at the unsettling scene, but most of the spectral undead disintegrated the moment they hit the Forbiddance Field. Soraka looked up at the few that had missed it by flying too high. "Uh-oh," Mitra said. "Air elementals. Prepare to intercept. Summon Monster V." The druids and sacred claws in Soraka's entourage summoned their elementals just as an undead beast arced through the clear blue sky. It crashed to the ground a few dozen meters below the wall. More followed, and soon the sky was filled with cows, horses, sheep, goats, boars and other zombified animals. A few failed to make it over the defensive fields, but that number was getting lower as the seconds passed. "We're not stopping that with so few elementals," Karavaki said. "That's not what they're for," Soraka replied. "Once they start consistently clearing the barrier, expect worse." Shouts rose along the walls. The undead projectiles started coming apart in the air as Rolengork's hunters intercepted them. "Here they come." As expected, once whatever was launching the undead over the defense fields figured out a safe height for the undead to cross over, Death Knights started joining the rain of undead beasts. They were curled up on themselves as they ascended, looking like spiky black trebuchet rounds. The first of the Death Knights stopped at the vertex of its parabolic flight and was sent back in the opposite direction. It crashed back into the brush at the bottom of the ravine. "Don't send them straight back down. We want them to take as much damage as possible." The next Death Knight was caught and tossed further into the air. Still, even more made it through. They landed below the walls on either side of the bridge, raising their tower shields over their heads as a storm of bullets flew in to assail them. "This is too many for my people to fight at once," Ranasaj said. "They don't have to defeat them," Soraka said. "Delaying tactics are fine. We'll make our way around cleaning these up." Ranasaj descended the tower, bellowing out orders. Soraka hopped down onto the wall, grabbing the Death Knight that had landed there by the vambrace and flinging it back down the ravine. It hit the slope halfway to the bottom and tumbled into the trees. "Gladestalkers, stay on the wall and knock any undead that landed on top of them back down. Mitra, go with the warriors and take half of the druids and sacred claws. I'll be up on the wall with the Gladestalkers." One of his guards jumped off of the wall with a roar, knocking down a Death Knight scaling the ravine. He picked it up and hurled it back through the defensive fields and into the brush. More guards streamed past him, half of them sending Death Knights to the bottom of the ravine while the other half worked on destroying their opponents. Soraka observed the surroundings as more Death Knights landed on the slope. There's no end to this. Or, more accurately, they had no time. While they were at the part of the front that was having the most trouble, the fighting only involved a third of the enemy's forces. If they were tied up for too long, their front would be the only one standing while the rest of Rolengork's forces were crushed. 2 more Death Knights dropped onto the wall ahead of them. His entourage shifted forward to tie them up. Soraka narrowed his eyes, looking over his shoulder. We're being drawn away from the bridge. Reduce the number of opponents and hold here. Several undead went tumbling down the slope, but they were replaced by more. Soraka looked around, trying to figure out what the enemy commander was trying to do. Getting knocked back down into the ravine through the field defenses wasn't something that the undead could keep up with for long, so if it was a delaying tactic, it wasn't a very effective one. If there was a trap being set, he couldn't see it. Kasturi, he said, can you see what's going on in the north? It's over the horizon, the Gladestalker replied. There isn't a vantage around here high enough to let me see that far. The portions of the front that I can see are still holding. Zombies started to appear ahead of them as the Death Knights that they were ignoring turned on Rolengork's defenders. Several attempts to hold its attention failed before someone strong enough appeared. The other warriors closed in to pick the Death Knight apart, but, then, droplets of hissing black bile rained over them. A weep landed shortly after, adding to the cries of dismay as it slashed at everything it could reach. Take down that weep. Keep an eye out for more. Everywhere warriors gathered to take on the Death Knights, a weep landed. Soraka's Gladestalkers worked on destroying any they could get a clean angle of attack on. More and more felt to repeat the same scene across the front, and Soraka furrowed his brow. Didn't we focus on taking the weeps down while they were on their way here? We did, Kasturi replied. Then why are there so many landing on us now? They may be summons, Karawaki said. The temporary sort. Summon undead V should be able to produce them. Even so, Soraka said, this is way too many. Another weep landed, this time amidst Mitra's group. They turned away from the Death Knight they were working on to destroy it. Is everyone all right down there? We're good. The other defenders probably aren't, though. He was well aware of that, but they didn't have the mana to cure thousands of warriors afflicted by the poisonous bile. If things continued as they were, Rolengork's mystics would be completely out of mana if they tried to cure everyone. If they didn't, their forces would slowly weaken and die from the poison. Not only was the use of weeps a bid to disrupt the defenders, but they were also being used to nullify the Beastman force's mana advantage. The undead wouldn't need any clever tactics to secure victory in that case. Once the defenders were out of mana, they wouldn't be able to sustain much of anything and the undead wouldn't allow anyone the time they needed to rest. While it very much had the feel of a first battle between Rolengork's combined forces and the undead, it was in reality the only battle, one that would stretch on until the defenders were exhausted and collapsed. Report. You're Soraka, right? I am. He glanced at the young bar runner. Rana Saj says that the undead are moving to secure the bridge. Their numbers are too great to hold back. So, they were trying to position us away from their objective. Let Rana Saj know we're on our way, Soraka said. Throw those undead into the ravine, we're heading back to the bridge. His bodyguard complied, but the moment they moved toward the highway, 2 Death Knights came to taunt them. Soraka broke his subordinates out of the effect, but the Death Knights continued to hound their withdrawal. Past the Death Knights, the defenders sent worried looks toward him as they struggled against their own opponents. He wondered how many would survive, but if a decisive victory wasn't achieved by the evening, none of them would. By the time they reached the bridge, both sides were under undead control. Clan Kira had been pushed east past the tower. Several warbands alternated between engaging and avoiding their foes, using the combination of entangle and freedom that Soraka had mentioned. Prepare to form up. Gladestalkers can continue fighting from the wall. Take down those casters supporting from the rear. Soraka hopped down and kicked away one of the pesky Death Knights on his guard's tails. He sent the other one tumbling at it, then turned to take advantage of the opening. Shayana Vyuha. Push the undead back down the bridge. His entourage rapidly formed a battle line with 6 warriors on each wing. Mitra stood at the tip of the beak of the hawk formation, while Soraka stood at the neck. The druids and sacred claws formed the body. Within 3 seconds of Soraka issuing his orders, they charged and smashed into the flank of the undead spearhead, closing the distance in a blink. Keep pushing. Burn in 6. The violent impact compacted the undead ranks. Karavaki and the other casters raised their hands. Maximize magic, flame strike. 6 columns of divine fire fell from the heavens and washed over the undead. Unlike the living, who would have surely flinched and scattered away, the undead continued forward through the tremendous damage, focusing solely on their objective. This, however, worked to Soraka's advantage. Again. Maximize magic, flame strike. Lack of fear and the capability to ignore staggering pain and crippling injuries were often touted as an advantage that the undead had over the living. Here, however, it was being used to keep them in an ideal arrangement for area of effect spells. The Death Knight in front of Mitra fell apart. For those that survived, arms and legs were still seared away and the resistance of the undead ranks crumbled. Rana Saja's forces joined the push across the bridge. When they crossed the threshold of the forbidden spell, a full third of the undead disintegrated. After that, the surviving undead put up resistance again, though it was because they were being slowed by the stone spikes, a higher-tier version of spike growth for stony terrain, and entangle fields behind the forbidden spell. Dispel the stone spikes on the bridge. Don't push them off, destroy every last one of them. Soraka's attention went from the violence in front of him to the fields beyond. The undead forces were reacting to the turnaround on the bridge by bringing in forces to cover the hole. Several squads of undead came out of the river, as well as forces from all around as they reacted to the sudden development. His eyes narrowed as they moved toward a contingent of Death Knights that were still in the same position where he had seen them at the beginning of the advance. Why are those still there? His gaze went past the contingent, following the highway as it passed between the Roland Gork and a small hill. His eyes stopped at the hill, which was topped by a single tree. Gladestalkers, come and join us. Kasturi and the others hopped down to join him. The defenders on the walls were still embroiled in their battle with the Death Knights, but no more could be seen being lobbed through the sky. To either side, the undead were still rushing to form up with the ones stationed on the highway. Rana Saj. Soraka called out to the Bar Lord as he checked over his warriors. What is it? Rana Saj came jogging up to him. We're going on the offensive. On the offensive where? Soraka made an inconspicuous gesture with his head. See that hill over there? He said, the undead are positioned to protect it. Are you saying that the enemy commander is using it as a vantage? It's an opportunity that we can't give up, Soraka said. Gather your clan. We may be able to put a stop to the undead in one decisive move. Rana Saj called for his forces, but Soraka only waited for as long as it took his entourage to refresh their enchantments. They had to move before the undead finished reconsolidating their lines. As the hill slowly came closer, he turned to Kasturi. Kasturi, Soraka said. That hill over there, what do you see? The Gladestalker shaded her eyes with a paw. One female human child sitting at a small wooden table, that's not weird at all. The undead of Katza are human-themed, Soraka said. A real human certainly wouldn't be calmly sitting behind the undead lines. Rana Saj, we're going to punch through that escort and overwhelm her position. Do you think it will be a difficult fight? It might be. Or she could try and run away before we get there. Between all of us, however, we should come out on top. The undead escort had bulked up somewhat by the time they came within 500 meters. Soraka called for a tighter formation. My forces will create the opening you need to get through, he told Rana Saj. After we break through, spread out to cover the hill just in case she tries to run away. Once we get close, we'll have our hunters run ahead and begin harassing the target. If she's a necromancer of some sort, they may destroy her outright. I hope this works out, Rana Saj said. I don't think our forces could survive to nightfall otherwise. Their pace increased as contact with the undead escort grew imminent. A wall of black tower shields faced them, but it wouldn't help in any way. Scatter them. Turn undead. The members of the undead escort fled in every direction. Between Karavaki and the other sacred claws, it was an inevitable outcome. The only exceptions were the 3 Death Knights that turned to dust on the spot. Clan Kiera flowed around and past the broken position. "This is it," Soraka shouted, "go." Even as he urged Rana Saj and his clan forward, a sense of foreboding swept over him. Then, a solitary figure fell out of the sky to land on the highway in front of them. Her voice resounded in the air with crystal clarity. "Stand your ground." As one, the undead stopped. They immediately turned around and converged on Soraka and his allies. A grim expression graced Ludmiller's features as she silently watched the advance of her forces. It was true that they were rapidly gaining ground, yes, but the manner in which they did so was more displeasing than anything else. Across the 10-kilometer-long section of her front, the members of her infantry squads flung themselves into the fray with wild abandon. They hacked, slashed, stabbed and bashed their way forward, though which way forward was dependent on which servitor one happened to be looking at. Some had separated so far from their comrades that she wasn't even sure if they could see one another. Was I really that angry? The undead servitors of the Sorceress Kingdom supposedly acted according to the will of the one directing them. She was admittedly frustrated over the tactics that the Beastmen had come up with to isolate and destroy her troops, but she wasn't furious to the point that she wanted her forces to throw caution to the wind and scatter in every direction as they rampaged throughout the front. And yet, here they were. Ludmiller was reasonably certain that the Beastmen would have inflicted even more losses if she hadn't called her Elder Liches forward to add to the chaos. Each one of them cast summon undead V, producing an undead being known as a weep. The eyeless, sore-infested things had a difficulty rating in the high 70s and she would have used them sooner, but they were too high to include in an undead horde and would have been a constant drain on the Elder Lich's mana. "We need to reorder our lines," Ludmiller said. "This one fails to see why such measures are necessary," Psycho replied. "They may not be necessary at the moment, but not taking every opportunity to instill proper martial habits into the Royal Army is tantamount to negligence. Discipline and technique are cultivated over time, they must be achieved in advance of any event where necessity calls for them." Who is the Chief of Staff of the Southeast Army Group, anyway? It was a question born out of frustration more than anything else, as Ludmiller already knew the answer. The Southeast Army Group didn't have a Chief of Staff assigned to it. Instead, it was administered as an extension of Army Group Center, which was responsible for the security of Iranthal and the capital region. In other words, its affairs were directed by the civilian administration of the Sorceress Kingdom. The priorities of the administration meant that their training and experience differed substantially from the army groups with military commanders managing them. While the North and Southwest Army groups focused on the development of the Sorceress Kingdom's armed forces, the Southeast Army Group did what the civilian administration considered important. This meant that their activities revolved around the duties that servitors deployed for domestic work were expected to know. They patrolled the areas of the Katsa Plains that bordered friendly countries, keeping them clear of wild undead. The ruined cities concealed deep within the wasteland had been cleaned up and converted into training centers where Death Series servitors and Elder Liches familiarized themselves with customs routines and sentry duties. They even simulated various crimes for servitors in training to respond to. Solitas practiced pulling various vehicles around or were acclimated to powering industrial machinery. Outside of those activities, they were placed on standby, or, as Leon put it, placed in storage. There were so many in storage that the combined forces operating in the Draconic Kingdom barely amounted to 5% of their total number. Any outsider who saw them would probably flee to the furthest corner of the world or just commit suicide thinking that the world was doomed anyway. In conventional terms, the army groups managed by the civilian administration were trained as militia or meant to serve as rentals. It was strange to think it strange, as that was what security forces managed by civilian administrations generally were. What was actually strange was that the civilian administration was managing the Royal Army at all, and the majority of it at that. The arrangement was yet another manifestation of the odd way that the Sorceress Kingdom's highest echelons did things. Under Lady Shiltier, Ludmiller had drawn many parallels between her liege's duties and her own, but there were still some things that were too foreign or just didn't make sense at all. Grand Marshal Cocytus was officially the head of the Royal Army, but Prime Minister Albedo was his superior, and that somehow meant that she could take most of the Royal Army under her control for her purposes. Some of those purposes seemed reasonable, such as the need to train militia, while others felt completely arbitrary. That's how it works, and it's the way things are meant to be, answered Little for Ludmiller, yet both Lord Cocytus and Lady Shiltier thought it a matter of course. I should have brought my own regiments in. Marshal Saul Khanyan's insistence on handling the beastmen in the southern provinces while the royal army dealt with the Orakalon Reach meant that Ludmiller's forces ended up staying at home. Not that the Southeast Army group was so terrible that it merited replacement. In fact, they were probably as perfect as one could get for the task right up until the point where they met resistance from the warrior clans. Since they were trained as militia, they operated in the idealized form that the civilian administration demanded. As a result, they sorted out the Draconic Kingdom as they swarmed over it like a horde of groundskeepers, cleaning up towns, villages, and roads as they went. Refuse was picked up, buildings and infrastructure inspected, corpses, and pieces of corpses, were collected and vehicles parked in designated areas. Armies usually left a mess in their wake as a consequence of conflict, but this army did the exact opposite. However, as nice as it was, that wasn't the primary purpose of a professional military. When she was assigned personnel from the Southeast Army Group, Ludmiller rationalized it as an exercise and practical experience for troops that sorely needed it. She even thought them ideal for the role as they chased the civilian tribes across the Draconian Kingdom. Unfortunately, that was all proven to be wishful thinking. As with any army, the Royal Army of the Sorceress Kingdom needed to be able to function as an army before entering any theater as one. The lack of discipline wasn't the first sign of the problem, either. Various issues manifested on an organizational level long before ones directly related to combat operations. The sergeants weren't accustomed to field operations and struggled to stay on top of everything. As a result, their officers worked non-stop to make up for the difference. This didn't work very well when there were only 5 of them. An officer in the Imperial Army oversaw 5 sergeants. In the Draconic Kingdom, Ludmiller and her officers were overseeing 30 elder liches who were sergeants in name and 200 more with their dominated auxiliaries. Things worked so long as they went roughly according to plan. They became a mess otherwise. One might have seen this and concluded that the problem was a shortage of officers. But, while that would have helped and was slated for the future, the fact of the matter was that the organizational issues that they were facing wouldn't have been as severe if the Southeast Army Group had the same training as the North or Southwest. They could hardly blame the servitors for not receiving the proper training, they just had to deal with it, as Lady Shiltier was wont to say. Ludmiller had brought up the issue with the general staff, and they all agreed that it was an issue. Agreement was all that seemed to come out of it, however, as the ways of the royal court acted as an impassable barrier to improvement. How do I even deal with this? It was said that, in lieu of the desires of the living, the undead pursued what they considered important with an intensity that the living would consider madness. It was also said that summons desired nothing else but fulfilling the will of their master. The chaos below appeared to be the result. Every beastman slain signaled success. And, so, they went out and slew beastmen without end. Not out of bloodlust or even the things that people commonly attributed to the undead, but out of a desire to fulfill their purpose. Like children who wished only to please their parents, the undead servitors gleefully went about turning the fields red with the blood of their foes. She idly wondered whether the Sorcerer King had ever experienced one of his death knights running off on him before. Are Olga's forces displaying the same behavior? Ludmiller asked. It appears to be the case, Psycho replied. However, the squads under her command are not achieving the same gains as those on the Western Front. She had hoped that the noticeably slower progress meant that she was able to keep her subordinates under control. Apparently not. What do you think is causing the difference? Command equality. Of course. It wasn't any particular thing that she did, it was her build. Job class levels were the go-to answer when it came to the analysis of the elder liches. They were probably on the right track, but it felt reductive to the extreme. It might have been that the sum of her life resulted in job class levels, but they were seen as the entirety of what a person was rather than being a part of them. That sort of thinking didn't sit well with her, and it had long become pervasive within the Sorceress Kingdom's undead administration. She could understand the desire to optimize, but the way the central administration saw things precluded any notions of personal agency. As a noble, she knew that things just tended to look that way whenever they were put to paper, but she was almost certain that the central administration literally saw people that way. One also needs to account for the possibility that there are differences in the opposition, Ludmiller told Psycho. People aren't summons, and armies are never perfectly uniform in troop quality. Psycho offered no response. The Elder Lich probably didn't have any appreciation for what she had said. Even Nonna, who was in constant contact with Ludmiller's subjects, almost seemed offended when one farmer's yield was slightly different from another's, or even with logs from woodcutters having different volumes or requiring different durations to season. None of her audits turned up anything, but that only seemed to offend her even more. Ludmiller frowned as Raoul's skeletal dragon banked east before it reached the river. "Raoul, mind your positioning. You're getting too close to the front." The skeletal dragon altered its course slightly. Ludmiller turned her attention back to the beastmen, eyeing the line of fortifications in the distance. She had watched their progress since arriving at the front and conducting attacks all night, though she was still unsure how the towers had come into being. Her best guess was that they used magic to shape the stone and Rolengork's forces had mystics aplenty. Overall, it was a normal enough thing. If people knew that they would fight a set-piece battle somewhere, they would inevitably raise some defenses. The Imperial Army raised earthworks to counter their infantry-heavy opposition, both demi-humans and humans alike. Reistais used anti-cavalry defenses because the Empire primarily fielded cavalry. From what she had seen of Rolengork's defenses during her flight with Ilishnish, the beastmen favored high stone fortifications that commanded a view of the surrounding terrain. Those defenses run to the riverbank, but they don't run along the riverbank. Are they that confident that they can resist Raoul's assaults during the day? The fortifications encircled Eastwatch, so it was also true that any attacks from the rear would be caught between the fortress city and the first defensive line. It made for an easy encirclement if they simply gave way to attackers and formed up behind them. Since they had proven that they could trap and destroy Death Series servitors, getting caught deep in the beastmen's forces presented substantial risks. "Raoul, keep your attacks quick and shallow. They may look soft along the riverbank, but that location is ideal for entrapping attackers." "Captain," Psycho said, "the beastmen are accelerating their withdrawal." Below them, Rolengork's forces seemed to melt away, but it wasn't a rout. Their warbands still maintained discipline as they retreated to their fortifications. "Reform the lines. Do not pursue." She put extra emphasis into her order, hoping that it would count for something. Thankfully, the infantry squad stopped, though the Death Warriors pulled out their crossbows and continued attacking from where they were. "Well, I didn't say not to attack." Ludmiller looked behind to the dominated forces bringing up the rear. The infantry squads had gained a kilometer on them since she called for a general advance. She returned her attention to the beastmen and her eyes settled on where the highway spanned the shallow ravine in front of the beastmen's earthworks. "They've set some sort of trap in the ravine," she murmured. "Studies have proven that rangers cannot detect traps from over a kilometer away," Psycho told her. "I didn't detect any traps directly," Ludmiller replied. "The beastman forces are using the bridges to cross rather than just going through the ravine. There's no reason why they shouldn't, especially when they have enemies behind them. All forces, advance. Maintain your lines." Despite seeing that Ludmiller's forces had resumed their advance, the beastmen still insisted on using the bridges. There was definitely something waiting for her forces in the ravine. "Infantry squads, once you enter the ravine, find some cover and hold your positions. Controllers, prepare a variety of undead to investigate the terrain for traps." A bullet clanked off of the shield of a Death Knight. She gauged the distance to the ravine. That attack was from over 700 meters away. "We have no record of an attack being made from that distance by the beastmen with such accuracy," Psycho said. Another bullet whistled in, taking the head off of an Elder Lich sergeant. "Form shield walls. There's a powerful ranger in the enemy forces." A death priest restored the Elder Lich's head. They moved to take cover behind the line of tower shields. More bullets struck the wall of metal. "How are their shields holding out?" Ludmiller asked. "No damage has been reported so far," Psycho answered. "Maybe they were using a specific set of martial arts to strike accurately from so far away." A weep fell to the ground, its leg blasted off just above the knee. Another lost its arm at the shoulder, and the stump spurted sizzling black bile as the weep ignored the damage and continued forward. "Controllers, they're imbuing their attacks with holy damage to disable regeneration. Expect to lose your summons, but don't replace them just yet. Let's pick up the pace." The wall of shields advanced at a jog, though it seemed like a walk with the fields churned to mud. "Captain," Psycho said, "high-altitude observers have lost track of the skeletal dragon in use by Sub-Commander Raoul." Ludmiller stared at the Elder Lich. "What about Raoul?" she asked. "Unknown. Contact his adjutant and find out what happened." She looked toward the Oracle, but there was nothing to see but the sun reflecting off of the water. Did he get too close to the shore and get detected through invisibility? That shouldn't have been the case, as she had just warned him about it. "Captain," Psycho said, "this one is unable to establish contact with Sub-Commander Raoul's adjutant." The adjutant was destroyed? The message spell failed to reach its intended recipient, which meant that the recipient no longer existed or was being blocked somehow. The former seemed to be the most likely case, considering that they were flying over a river. "Let's gain some altitude," Ludmiller said. "Do not go within a kilometer of that wall." Whatever took down Raoul's skeletal dragon saw right through its invisibility. "That means you're at risk, as well. Try contacting Raoul." A skeletal dragon and an Elder Lich adjutant. Squads of Death Series servitors. Yet, even with all of that, the enemy managed to get him. Ludmiller looked toward the Oracle again. She figured he would be next to untouchable when she brought him along. Now, she was wondering if he was dead. Could he be resurrected? If not, how could she bring herself to face the parents who had entrusted their son to her care? "Captain," Psycho said, "this one has established contact with Sub-Commander Raoul." She breathed a sigh of relief. "Is he all right?" "The Sub-Commander is currently floating down the Oracle. No injuries were reported. An Elder Lich has been dispatched to retrieve him." Psycho paused for a moment before speaking again. "A Death Knight from Squad 28 has been destroyed." A tendril of anxiety rose within her. "That's one of Raoul's. Is something chasing after him?" "Squad 28 is currently attacking Beastman positions along the river." "Squad 28, withdraw into the river." "They are unable to comply," Psycho said. "The entire squad has fallen victim to the taunt tactics of the Beastmen." This again. Her fading worry for Raoul was replaced with mounting frustration. She still hadn't come up with a solution for the problem aside from an all-out attack. "Where are they?" Ludmiller sighed. Psycho pointed down at the bridge. Ludmiller had the Elder Lich stand by while she carefully descended to take a closer look. By the time she came close enough to make out the details of the fight, it was already over. She returned to Psycho, not willing to risk detection with what appeared to be several powerful rangers at large. "I couldn't catch any details," Ludmiller said. "How did they end up out of the river, anyway?" "They were ordered to attack," Psycho replied. "Going by what the squad sergeant related to this one before it perished, they were supposed to be part of a larger effort." "So you're saying that only the first squad in the assault received their orders before Raoul's adjutant was destroyed?" She wasn't sure what to think. Not only was it an extraordinarily unlucky event, but the sole squad that had received its orders faithfully carried them out in vain. Ludmiller closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Olga, Raoul went for a swim. Take command of his squads on your side. Also, mind your distance to the front. The Beastmen have spells or individuals that can see through invisibility, and they're landing accurate attacks from a kilometer away." "Psycho, have our sergeants found anything in this ravine?" "The Beastmen have prepared traps on their side of the ravine," the Elder Lich replied. "Most notably are what appears to be spike growth spells." And, just like that, all of their weak undead were rendered useless. Fleshy undead would be sliced to ribbons trying to cross the spike growth. Skeletons would eventually get through, but a single bullet from even the weakest Beastman hunter would destroy them. "What are they trying now?" "We are investigating the extent of the spike growth effect with blood-meat hulks, as well as anything else that may be in place. Blood-meat hulks are being destroyed across the front." "By what?" "Unknown. Their demise was instantaneous." Ludmiller waited as the sergeants continued their testing. While that happened, the undead continued to gather in the ravine. She pondered how she might assault the Beastmen's position. "How high is this magical barrier that's destroying all of our test subjects?" she asked. "Is it just a ground effect like spike growth?" "Spectral undead such as wraiths have triggered the effect," Psycho answered, "so it is not restricted to ground targets or those with physical form." "Check for a maximum height," Ludmiller told the Elder Lich. "I can't imagine that it goes up forever." She peered down at a cluster of wraiths as they emerged from the ravine, nodding her head slowly as a few crossed over the top of the barrier. "Looks like the way across is over. Death Warriors, start tossing undead over to the wall. Use lesser undead until you're confident you can make the throw. The Death Warriors already had some practice throwing other undead around during the assaults on towns that they made along the way west, so it didn't take them too long to figure out how much power they needed to put into it. Soon, undead beasts were falling amongst the beastmen. A weep was intercepted by a defender's bullet, but that only caused its skin to rupture and shower the beastmen with poisonous black bile. When Death Knights started arcing through the air, however, a few of them seemed to bounce back and crash into the trees at the bottom of the ravine. I have no idea what happened there, Ludmiller said. Is there some other barrier in place? There is not enough data for speculation, Psycho replied. The servitors encountering the barrier only felt themselves being pushed back. She didn't ponder the strange phenomena for long, as something far more worrisome appeared. A few dozen beastmen, including 2 lords, sortied from the tower overlooking the highway, sweeping north to clear the accumulation of undead. Unlike the others, they didn't seem to struggle against the Death Series servitors at all, tossing many back into the ravine while keeping a few to fight against. Those that were tossed aside took significant damage as they fell back through the magical defenses. A strong beastman warband has appeared. Lure them north. Get them as far from the bridge as possible. Everyone else, gather to take the bridge. Not half a minute later, the beastmen stopped and started fighting their way back the way they came. Based on the curve of the wall, they shouldn't have been able to see what was going on at the bridge, but they still somehow knew what she was trying to do. That group of beastmen is going to be a problem, Ludmiller said. Shall we have the infantry squads intercept them? Psycho asked. No, Ludmiller shook her head. They're coming for the infantry squads. She wanted to withdraw her forces, but she couldn't. They were fully committed to securing the bridge and were locked into a momentous push that was steadily driving the beastmen back. To the side, the group of strong beastmen was rapidly closing on the bridge. Incoming from the left flank. Brace yourselves. Even as her warning was delivered, the group of beastmen shifted, taking on the appearance of a falcon. In the split second that it took for her to register the formation, it smashed into the press of Death Knights, squishing them even closer together. Columns of flame streaked down to set the undead ablaze. What in the world? Were they Roland Gork's elite force? Something like one of the scriptures of the Theocracy or Baharuth's White Silver Imperial Guard? Ludmiller watched helplessly as her infantry squads were pushed back over the bridge. Death Knights seemed to fall apart from the mere act of being repulsed, and there were no more than a third left by the time they were thrown back onto the highway. All Western forces, withdraw back into the ravine. Squads in the Oraculon, head downstream to the original front. We need to consolidate for their counterattack, Ludmiller said. This is too late. Barely 5 minutes after retaking the bridge, the beastmen were on the move again. Not just the group of elites, but seemingly all of the beastmen not locked into their respective fights along the wall. Ludmiller descended, picking up speed as she tried to make it to the reserve squads guarding the approach to Queen Auricula's position before the beastmen did. It looks like Raoul's squads will make it in time. Will it be enough? There were 2 infantry squads on defense, plus 3 from Raoul's forces. In nearly any case, she would have thought it to be more than enough. Yet, now, something told her that it wasn't. Tighten ranks. Let none of them through. Ludmiller came within 100 meters of her forces, yet the beastmen were faster still. Her grip tightened on her glaive as she waited for the inevitable impact and breakthrough. Then, to her great relief, the beastmen stopped before the wall of black metal. Turn undead. Her mouth fell open as the infantry squads broke and scattered. Ludmiller's boots struck the pavement where her forces once stood. Her teeth clenched as she watched the tattered cloaks of her soldiers flutter in their flight. I can't let this happen. I won't. Her glaive cut a wide arc through the air as she turned to face her foe. Stand your ground. The world froze. No, it was the undead that froze, and the beastmen that froze upon seeing that they did. That moment lasted for a split second, and then her soldiers came roaring back to join their captain. Ludmiller raised her glaive, brandishing its blade at the beastman lord towering before her. It regarded her with a calm look before vanishing from her sight. In that instant, she activated Ability Boost, Strengthen Perception, and Invulnerable Fortress. The beastman lord reappeared in her vision. She brought up her polearm to block his overhead strike. And then she was blasted away like a leaf in a gale.